This video just mentions 3 of the properties of ionic compounds. The first 2 here, ionic compounds are crystalline solids and they have very high melting and boiling points. These are both the result of the strong attractions between ions. So when a substance has strong attractions, you can imagine it. It's like they're holding on to each other very tightly. And so when they hold tight, think about solids. Remember, solids are closely packed. Like when we were describing solids in chapter 1, they're closely packed. They have strong interactions. And so when you are held together tightly, you're going to form solids. Now, crystalline solids, this word crystalline means that the solid inside of it has a regular repeating pattern inside of it. That's what crystalline means. And if you recall looking at the illustrations in our presentation slides and also in your textbook, ionic compounds exist as crystal lattices or crystal arrays. And those, when you look at the illustrations in our book and in our slides, are very repetitive. It's a pattern, like it has positive, negative, positive, negative, positive, negative. And that's what they're talking about. Now, these strong attractions, when you're held close tightly, that means it takes a lot of energy to melt and boil because you have to overcome these attractions. So both being crystalline solids and having very high melting and boiling points are a consequence of the very strong attraction in ionic bonds. Now, the third thing, that they conduct electricity when dissolved in water, we're going to discuss more in chapter 8, I want to think. These are, when ionic compounds dissolve in water, they form something called an electrolyte. And that might sound familiar to you if you think about things like Gatorade. So what happens when you put ionic compounds in water and they dissolve? They do something called dissociate. I'm going to write that down. Now, not all compounds dissolve in water, but a lot of them do, and the ones that do will dissociate. And dissociate means that they fall apart or separate. And they'll separate into their ions. So, for example, what happens if you had sodium chloride, table salt, and you dissolve it in water? And one way we can represent something that's dissolved in water is by this symbol AQ. And AQ means aqueous, which designates dissolved in water. So when sodium chloride is dissolved in water, it's actually not hanging out like sodium chloride anymore. It's hanging out as sodium ions floating about and chloride ions. That's what it means, it dissociates. So ionic compounds, like in our blood, the ions are floating around separately because they have dissociated. Because once they dissolve, they will separate. So that is one of the properties of ionic compounds, is their ability to conduct electricity when they're in an aqueous solution. And the reason is they dissociate, they fall apart into their ions, and the electricity is carried through on ions. Now that brings us back to the Gatorade. The importance of electrolytes within our body in part has to do with the functions of our muscles, because we have an electrical impulse system, and one of the jobs of these ions is to help and assist in this electrical conductance. So things like Gatorade or drinks that replenish electrolytes, if you sweated profusely, if you were, doing athletic things and sweating profusely, or maybe something not as wonderful like you're having diarrhea or throwing up. If you're losing lots of fluids, along with that go the electrolytes that are dissolved in those fluids. And so replenishment of electrolytes through things like Gatorade would replenish the ions and help hopefully with the functioning of the muscles. So you might not have cramping, or even worse, sometimes if you're very sick, it can cause like heart palpitations and things if you didn't have the right balance of electrolytes. So that's what electrolytes are, and we'll talk more about electrolytes in chapter 8. I'm pretty sure it is chapter 8. But for now, what we need to know is that one of the properties of ionic compounds is that they are able to conduct electricity when dissolved in water. So good luck practicing, and as always, let me know if you have any questions.